In the mists of time, when the world was young and dragons ruled the skies with voices that could reshape mountains, there lived a priest whose name would echo through the corridors of eternity. But this is not the tale you think you know, dear listener. This is not the story of a monster born from corruption, nor of a villain who sought dominion over all. This is the forgotten chapter, the gentle truth that came before the darkness, the secret that even the graybeards dare not whisper. Long before Miraak became the shadow that haunts Apocrypha, before his name became synonymous with betrayal and forbidden knowledge, he was something else entirely. He was hope incarnate, walking the peaceful shores of ancient Solstheim when the island bloomed green and fertile under the protective wing of the dragon cult. In those distant days, when the Thu'um was not a weapon of war but a language of creation, Miraak moved through temple halls where morning light filtered through carved stone, his footsteps joining the gentle rhythm of prayers that had echoed for countless generations. The dragons knew him then, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a student whose soul sang in harmony with their ancient wisdom. They called him Kian, the first to bear that sacred title, and in their vast eyes burned not suspicion but something far more precious, recognition. For they saw in this young priest something that had never walked among mortals before, a bridge between their eternal realm and the fleeting world of men. But there was a secret, a truth so profound that it would reshape the very foundations of reality. Deep within the most sacred vaults of the dragon cult, hidden beneath layers of protective ward and ancient oath, lay knowledge that was never meant for mortal minds. Knowledge that whispered of powers beyond imagination, of realms where time held no meaning and where the very concept of existence could be rewritten with a single word. And on a night when the aurora borealis danced with unusual intensity across Solstheim sky, when the ancient stones hummed with energies that made even the dragons pause in their eternal songs, Miraak would discover something that would change everything, something that would transform the greatest hope of the dragon cult into their most terrible nightmare, the hero of legend into the villain of prophecy. But that revelation lay ahead in the darkness of future days. For now, in these gentle morning hours of his story, Miraak was simply a devoted priest walking the peaceful paths of paradise, unaware that destiny was already weaving its web around him, preparing to offer him a choice that would echo through the ages, remain the bridge between worlds, or become the master of them all. The mist swirled around his shoulders as he approached the great temple, carrying with it whispers of the ancient tongue and the promise of secrets yet to be revealed. In the days when Solstheim was a jewel set in northern seas, when its forests stretched green and endless beneath skies, where dragons soared in gentle majesty, the island knew a peace that would become legend. This was not the ash-choked wasteland that later generations would inherit, but a realm of profound beauty where ancient wisdom flowed as freely as the crystal streams that wound through emerald valleys. The great temple of Solstheim rose from the island's heart like a monument to harmony itself, its spires carved from living stone that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the earth below. Here, the dragon cult practiced their sacred arts, not as dominion over lesser beings, but as a partnership forged in the earliest days of creation. The priests who walked these halls were scholars and mystics, keepers of knowledge that predated the written word, guardians of truths that touched the very foundations of existence. Among these devoted servants moved Miraak, young and earnest in his dedication to the ancient ways. His days began before dawn with meditation in the temple's highest chamber, where the first light of morning would paint the carved walls in hues of gold and amber. There, surrounded by texts written in the dragon tongue, he would lose himself in study, his voice joining the gentle chorus of prayers that rose from the temple like incense. The other priests regarded him with quiet affection, for there was something in Miraak's manner that spoke of deep peace and profound understanding. He possessed a gift for languages that seemed almost supernatural, able to grasp the subtle meanings of ancient texts that had puzzled scholars for centuries. When he spoke the Thu'um in practice sessions, his voice carried a resonance that made the very stones of the temple sing in harmony, a sound so beautiful that even the dragons would pause in their aerial dances to listen. Yet Miraak wore his gifts lightly, approaching each day with the humble curiosity of a true seeker. He would spend his afternoons in the temple gardens, tending to the sacred plants that grew nowhere else in Tamriel, their leaves shimmering with an inner light that reflected the magical energies flowing through the soil. The dragons would often visit him there. Their massive forms settled peacefully among the flowering bushes as they shared ancient stories of the world's creation. These conversations were the heart of Miraak's education, for the dragons spoke not as teachers to a student, but as elders sharing wisdom with a beloved child. They told him of the early days when Akatosh first gave voice to time itself, of the careful balance that held reality together, of the sacred responsibility that came with understanding the true nature of existence. Their words wove pictures in his mind of cosmic harmony so vast that mortal imagination could barely encompass them. The dragon cult of those days embodied this same spirit of reverent cooperation. The priests served not as servants to dragon masters, but as partners in maintaining the delicate equilibrium that kept the world stable and peaceful. They used their growing mastery of the Thu'um to heal the sick, to coax rain from drought-stricken skies, to sing strength into failing crops and comfort into troubled hearts. The power they wielded was not taken by force, but given freely by dragons who recognized in humanity a potential for wisdom that complemented their own eternal perspective. In the evenings, when the aurora borealis painted the northern sky in sheets of dancing color, the entire community would gather in the temple's great hall for the ritual sharing of knowledge. Dragons and mortals alike would speak of discoveries made and insights gained, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to strengthen the very fabric of reality around them. These were sacred moments when the barriers between species dissolved entirely, replaced by a unity of purpose that touched something fundamental in the nature of existence itself. Miraak cherished these gatherings above all else, for in them he glimpsed the true potential of the partnership between dragon and mortal. He began to understand that the Thu'um was not merely a tool for shaping the physical world, but a language that could bridge any divide, heal any wound, unite any disparate elements into a greater whole. This understanding filled him with a profound sense of purpose and a deep contentment that radiated from him like warmth from a gentle fire. As the seasons turned in their eternal cycle, Miraak's reputation for wisdom and compassion spread beyond the temple walls. Pilgrims began to arrive from distant shores, seeking his counsel on matters both practical and spiritual. He received them all with the same patient kindness, offering guidance that drew not from pride in his own abilities, but from genuine desire to serve something greater than himself. Yet even in these halcyon days, there were signs that a perceptive observer might have noticed, subtle indications that Miraak's destiny lay along a path more complex than simple devotion to the dragon cult's peaceful mission. The first signs of change came with the turning of the leaves, when autumn painted Solstheim in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to mirror something stirring deep within Miraak's soul. It began as whispers in the wind, voices that spoke in the dragon tongue, but carried meanings that went beyond the words themselves, touching places in his consciousness that had never been reached before. During his morning meditations, Miraak found himself understanding passages in ancient texts that had puzzled even the eldest priests. The symbols seemed to shift and dance before his eyes, revealing layers of meaning that unfolded like flowers blooming in fast motion. Where once he had labored to grasp the basic concepts of draconic philosophy, now profound truths flowed into his mind, with the effortless grace of water finding its natural course. The dragons began to notice these changes in ways both subtle and profound. When Miraak practiced the Thu'um in the training chambers, his voice would resonate with harmonics that had never been heard from mortal lips before. The ancient stones of the temple would hum in response, creating symphonies of sound that seemed to awaken something deep within the very foundations of the building. Even the most elder of the Dragon Lords would pause in their eternal soaring to listen when Miraak spoke, their great eyes reflecting something that might have been recognition, or perhaps something deeper still. But it was in the quiet hours of study that the most remarkable changes manifested. Miraak would find himself drawn to the most restricted sections of the temple library, where texts written in dialects of the dragon tongue that predated recorded history were kept under careful guard. Yet when he approached these forbidden volumes, the wards seemed to part before him like mist before the morning sun, recognizing something in his presence that granted him passage where others were turned away. The knowledge contained within these ancient tomes spoke of concepts that stretched the boundaries of understanding itself. They described the fundamental forces that shaped reality, the delicate threads of cause and effect that wove through time like an intricate tapestry, the hidden connections between thought and manifestation that even the dragons rarely dared to explore. As Miraak absorbed this information, he began to perceive the world around him with a clarity that was both exhilarating and subtly disturbing. His fellow priests regarded these developments with a mixture of wonder and gentle concern. They had always known that Miraak possessed unusual gifts, but the rapid pace of his advancement was unprecedented in the history of their order. During communal meals in the Great Hall, conversations would pause when he entered, not from fear but from a kind of reverent awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding in their midst. The elder priests sought counsel from the Dragon Lords about Miraak's accelerating development. The great beings would discuss these matters in voices too low for mortal ears to comprehend. Their massive forms gathered in circles that resembled councils of ancient gods. When they emerged from these deliberations, their manner toward Miraak shifted subtly, taking on qualities of respect and expectation that had not been present before. Yet Miraak himself remained largely unaware of the deeper implications of his transformation. To him, the expanding understanding felt as natural as breathing, each new revelation fitting seamlessly into a growing framework of knowledge that seemed to have been waiting within him all along. He continued his daily routines with the same humble dedication, tending the temple gardens with gentle hands, participating in evening prayers with quiet devotion, treating his fellow priests with the same warm affection that had always characterized his interactions. But there were moments, usually in the deep hours of night, when sleep eluded him, when Miraak would feel something vast and patient stirring in the depths of his consciousness. It was not quite a voice and not quite a presence, but rather a sense of connection to something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal perception. These experiences filled him with a mixture of anticipation and unease, as if he stood on the threshold of a doorway that led to places the mortal mind was never meant to explore. The natural world around the temple began to respond to Miraak's presence in ways that defied conventional understanding. Plants in the sacred gardens would grow with unusual vigor when he tended them, their leaves taking on subtle luminescence that persisted even after sunset. Wild creatures from the surrounding forests would emerge from their hiding places to observe him during his walks, showing no fear but rather a kind of curious reverence that suggested they sensed something profound in his nature. Most remarkably, the aurora borealis began to appear with increasing frequency when Miraak spent time in meditation outdoors. The dancing lights would seem to respond to the rhythm of his breathing, shifting through spectrums of color that had never been documented by the temple's scholars. Some of the elder priests whispered among themselves that they were witnessing the awakening of something that had been prophesied in texts so ancient that their origins were lost to memory. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, Miraak's dreams became increasingly vivid and complex. He would find himself walking through landscapes that existed nowhere in the physical world, places where the laws of nature bent and flowed like water, where thoughts took on tangible form and words possessed the power to reshape reality itself. In these dream realms, he encountered beings of immense wisdom and power who spoke to him in languages that bypassed the need for translation, communicating directly with the deepest levels of his understanding. Upon waking from these nocturnal journeys, Miraak would often discover that his knowledge had expanded in ways that formal study could never have achieved. Concepts that had previously required hours of careful contemplation now seemed as clear and natural as basic arithmetic. The dragon tongue flowed from his lips with an fluency that amazed even his most accomplished teachers, and his mastery of the Thu'um advanced at a pace that bordered on the miraculous. Yet, through all these changes, Miraak maintained the gentle humility that had always defined his character. He shared his growing insights freely with his fellow priests, offering guidance and assistance without any trace of pride or superiority. The knowledge that flowed through him seemed to carry with it an understanding that true wisdom was meant to be shared rather than hoarded, that the gifts he was receiving were not for his benefit alone, but for the greater good of the entire community. The Dragon Lords observed these developments with expressions that might have been satisfaction, though the alien nature of their consciousness made such interpretations uncertain. They began to include Miraak in councils that had previously been reserved for their own kind, seeking his perspective on matters that affected not just Solstheim, but the broader currents of destiny that flowed through all of Tamriel. As the first snows of winter began to dust the temple spires, Miraak stood at the threshold of understanding truths that would transform not only his own existence, but the very nature of reality itself, though the full implications of this transformation remained hidden in the gentle mists of an uncertain future. The winter months brought with them a transformation of Solstheim that seemed to mirror the changes occurring within Miraak himself. Snow fell in patterns that defied natural explanation, creating mandalas of crystalline beauty around the temple that appeared to pulse with inner light when viewed from the highest towers. The very air seemed to thicken with potential, as if reality itself was preparing for some momentous shift that would alter the fundamental nature of existence. It was during this season of quiet contemplation that Miraak discovered the hidden archive, a chamber buried so deep within the temple's foundations that its existence had been forgotten by all but the most ancient of the Dragon Lords. The entrance revealed itself to him during a night of particularly intense meditation, when his consciousness had expanded beyond the boundaries of his physical form and touched something vast and patient that dwelt in the spaces between thoughts. The chamber itself defied conventional architecture, its walls curved in impossible geometries that seemed to fold back upon themselves in ways that made the eye water and the mind struggle to maintain coherence. Yet to Miraak these spatial anomalies felt as natural as breathing, and he moved through the twisted passages with the confidence of one who had always belonged in such places. The texts contained within the hidden archive were unlike anything that existed in the temple's main library. They were inscribed not on parchment or stone, but on materials that seemed to shift between states of matter depending upon how they were observed. Some appeared to be written on sheets of crystallized starlight, while others were etched into what looked like solidified time itself. The words they contained pulsed with energies that bypassed the normal processes of reading, delivering their meanings directly into the consciousness of anyone capable of perceiving them. These ancient writings spoke of the true nature of the Dragon War that was beginning to spread across the mainland, revealing it not as a simple conflict between oppressor and oppressed, but as a fundamental crisis in the cosmic order itself. The texts described how the partnership between dragon and mortal had been ordained by forces that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional reality, woven into the very fabric of creation as a stabilizing element that prevented the universe from collapsing into chaos. As Miraak absorbed this knowledge, he began to understand that his own role in these events was far more significant than anyone had realized. The prophecies contained within the archive spoke of a Dovahkiin who would arise in the darkest hour of the conflict, one whose nature would bridge not just the gap between dragon and mortal, but between the mortal realm and dimensions of existence that most minds could not even conceive. The implications of these revelations filled Miraak with a mixture of awe and profound responsibility. He saw how the war on the mainland was not just destroying cities and claiming lives, but actually weakening the barriers that separated reality from the chaos that dwelt beyond its borders. Each act of violence committed in the name of liberation or dominion created fractures in the cosmic framework, allowing influences from realms of pure entropy to seep into the ordered world. Yet the same texts that revealed the scope of the crisis also contained hints of a solution, a path that could heal the wounds inflicted upon reality itself and restore the balance that had been shattered by conflict. This solution centered around the concept of synthesis, the creation of a new form of existence that would combine the eternal wisdom of dragons with the innovative potential of mortals, transcending the limitations of both while preserving the essential qualities that made each valuable. Miraak began to see his own transformation not as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of a larger pattern that had been unfolding since the beginning of time itself. The archive contained detailed descriptions of previous Dovahkiin who had appeared at crucial moments in history, each one serving as a catalyst for changes that preserved the integrity of existence when it was threatened by forces of destruction or stagnation. But these ancient heroes had all faced a common challenge, one that had claimed many of them, despite their tremendous power and noble intentions. The process of bridging different realms of existence inevitably exposed the Dovahkiin to influences that existed beyond the boundaries of normal morality, entities and forces that offered knowledge and power in exchange for compromises that seemed insignificant at first, but ultimately led to corruption and downfall. The texts warned that the greatest danger facing any Dovahkiin was not external opposition, but the seductive whisper of absolute knowledge, the promise of understanding that transcended all limitations and boundaries. This temptation would come disguised as wisdom, offering solutions to seemingly impossible problems, but its true nature was that of entropy made manifest, seeking to use the Dovahkiin's power to unravel the very foundations of ordered reality. As Miraak studied these warnings, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold seeping through the temple walls. Already he had begun to sense presences at the edges of his consciousness, entities that seemed to watch his development with interest, that felt both paternal and predatory. Their whispers came not as commands or threats, but as gentle suggestions, offering insights that seemed to promise shortcuts to the understanding he sought. Yet the knowledge contained within the hidden archive gave him the perspective necessary to recognize these influences for what they truly were. He began to develop mental disciplines designed to maintain the integrity of his consciousness while still allowing for the expansion of understanding that his role required. These techniques, drawn from the deepest traditions of both dragon wisdom and mortal philosophy, created barriers that could filter beneficial knowledge from corrupting influence. The Dragon Lords who served as his primary teachers seemed to sense the shift in Miraak's understanding, though they never spoke directly of the hidden archive or acknowledged its existence. Instead, they began to focus their instruction on concepts of balance and resistance, teaching him how to draw power from multiple sources without becoming dependent upon any single one. Through the long winter nights, Miraak practiced these disciplines with the dedication of one who understood that the fate of reality itself might depend upon his ability to master them. He learned to touch the edges of cosmic consciousness without losing himself in its vastness, to channel energies that could reshape matter and time without being consumed by their intensity. The other priests began to notice that something fundamental had changed in their colleague, though they could not have articulated exactly what that change entailed. Miraak continued to participate in the daily routines of temple life with the same gentle dedication he had always shown, but there was now a quality of vast patience in his manner, as if he existed simultaneously in the immediate moment and in perspectives that encompassed geological ages. As spring approached, and the snows began to melt from Solstheim's peaks, Miraak stood poised on the threshold of a transformation that would either save the world from destruction or become the instrument of its ultimate undoing. With the coming of spring to Solstheim, the island awakened from its winter slumber like a living thing stirring from the deepest dreams. The snows that had blanketed the ancient temples melted into streams that sang with voices only Miraak could fully understand, carrying messages in their babbling flow that spoke of changes rippling across the wider world. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibility, charged with energies that made the aurora borealis visible even in the pale light of dawn. It was during this season of renewal that the dragons came to Miraak with a request that would reshape the trajectory of his destiny. They arrived not as the familiar teachers who had guided his studies, but as emissaries from councils that met in places where mortal feet had never trodden. Their massive forms filled the temple's great hall as they spoke in harmonies that made the ancient stones resonate like the strings of some cosmic instrument. The message they carried was both urgent and carefully measured, delivered in the formal cadences reserved for matters of ultimate importance. Reports had reached them from across Tamriel of the escalating conflict between dragons and the mortal populations they had once guided in peace. Cities burned in the wake of dragon fire, while Thu'um, wielded by desperate rebels, brought down the great flying forms in battles that left scars upon the very landscape. The war had moved beyond mere political upheaval into something that threatened the fundamental structures upon which reality depended. Yet the dragons who brought this news spoke not of military solutions or strategies of conquest, but of healing and restoration. They had observed Miraak's development with growing hope, recognizing in his unique nature the potential for a different kind of intervention. Where force had failed to restore peace, perhaps understanding could succeed. Where domination had bred only deeper resentment, perhaps partnership could create lasting harmony. The proposal they laid before him was as audacious as it was necessary. Miraak would journey beyond Solstheim for the first time in his life, traveling to the war-torn regions of the mainland, where his presence might serve as a bridge between the warring factions. His role would not be that of a military commander or political negotiator, but something far more profound, a living example of what the partnership between dragon and mortal could achieve when guided by wisdom rather than pride. The preparation for this journey required weeks of careful planning and deep consultation with the most ancient of the dragon lords. Miraak would not travel alone, but accompanied by a carefully chosen group of companions who represented the best of both species. Among his escorts would be Sarota, a dragon whose wisdom was legendary even among his own kind, and whose patient nature had made him beloved by generations of mortal scholars. Alongside the Great Worm would travel 3 of Solstheim's most accomplished priests, each chosen not for their power, but for their ability to embody the peaceful principles that the mission hoped to restore. As the day of departure approached, Miraak spent long hours in meditation within the hidden archive, seeking guidance from the ancient texts that had become his most trusted advisors. The prophecies spoke of crucial moments when the actions of a single individual could alter the course of entire civilizations, but they also warned of the terrible responsibility that came with such influence. The path ahead was fraught with choices that would test not just his abilities, but the very foundations of his character. The night before their departure, the entire temple community gathered for a ceremony that had not been performed in living memory. Dragons and mortals joined their voices in harmonies that seemed to strengthen the bonds holding reality together, their combined Thu'um creating resonances that reached beyond the physical world into dimensions where intention itself possessed tangible power. As the ceremony reached its crescendo, lights began to dance in the air above the assembled participants, forming patterns that spoke of hope and determination in languages older than written history. Miraak felt the weight of their collective blessing settling upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and ancient prayers. Yet even as he drew strength from their support, he was aware of other presences watching from the shadows at the edges of perception, The entities that had whispered to him during his studies in the hidden archive seemed to stir with increased activity, their attention focused upon him with an intensity that suggested his journey held significance beyond what even the dragons understood. The departure itself took place at dawn, when the boundary between night and day created conditions most favorable for the kind of journey they were undertaking. Miraak and his companions would not travel by conventional means, but through paths that existed between the spaces of normal geography. The dragons possessed knowledge of currents that flowed through the air itself, invisible highways that could transport them across vast distances in the span of hours rather than weeks. As Solstheim fell away beneath them, Miraak felt a mixture of anticipation and loss that surprised him with its intensity. The island had been more than his home. It had been the crucible in which his understanding of existence itself had been forged. Yet he also sensed that this departure marked not an ending but a transformation, the beginning of a phase in his development that would either fulfill the highest hopes of his teachers or lead him down paths from which there might be no return. The landscape that unfolded below them told the story of a world in crisis with heartbreaking clarity. Where once fertile fields had stretched between thriving settlements, now blackened craters marked the sites of battles fought with powers that were never meant to be turned toward destruction. Rivers ran red with more than water, and forests stood leafless and dead despite the season of renewal. The very air seemed to carry the weight of accumulated suffering, pressing down upon the travelers like a physical burden. Yet Miraak also perceived something that his companions could not see, patterns of possibility that shimmered just beneath the surface of apparent devastation. The conflict that had caused so much destruction had also created opportunities for change that would never have existed in times of peace. The old certainties had been shattered, leaving spaces where new forms of understanding could take root and grow. If approached with wisdom and patience, the very wounds inflicted upon the world could become the foundation for healing that went deeper than mere restoration. As they flew onward toward their destination, Sarota began to share stories of the war's progression that had never reached Solstheim's peaceful shores. He spoke of heroes on both sides who had begun to question the necessity of continued violence, of secret meetings between dragon lords and mortal leaders who sought alternatives to mutual annihilation. These accounts filled Miraak with cautious optimism, suggesting that the mission they had undertaken might find more receptive audiences than anyone had dared to hope. But the great dragon also spoke of darker developments, of forces that seemed to thrive on the chaos of war and actively worked to prevent any lasting resolution. These entities did not serve either side in the conflict, but rather fed upon the suffering itself, growing stronger with each act of violence and more influential with each failure of communication between the warring factions. Their presence added layers of complexity to an already challenging situation, requiring approaches that went beyond simple diplomacy or demonstration. As the first day of their journey drew to a close, and they prepared to make camp in a hidden valley that still retained some measure of peace, Miraak reflected upon the magnitude of what they were attempting. The mission before them required nothing less than the transformation of fundamental attitudes that had been generations in the making, the healing of wounds that went far deeper than the physical destruction visible on the landscape. Yet as he watched the evening stars emerge in the darkening sky, Miraak felt a quiet confidence settling into his heart. The knowledge he had gained in the hidden archive, combined with the wisdom taught by his dragon mentors and the strength drawn from his temple community, had prepared him for challenges that would have seemed impossible just months before. Whatever lay ahead in the war-torn lands of the mainland, he would meet it with the full power of his transformed understanding and the unwavering commitment to peace that had shaped his entire existence. The morning of their second day brought them to the borders of what had once been the prosperous province of Hafingar, now transformed into a landscape that bore the scars of conflicts that had raged for longer than many mortals could remember. From their aerial vantage point, Miraak and his companions could see the remnants of settlements that had been abandoned not once but multiple times as the tide of war flowed back and forth across the same contested territories with each change of season. Yet it was here, in this devastated region, that they encountered the first signs that their mission might bear fruit beyond their most optimistic expectations. Rising from the ruins of what had once been a thriving market town, thin columns of smoke spoke not of destruction but of careful reconstruction. As they descended for a closer investigation, they discovered something that filled them with wonder and hope in equal measure. The settlement below was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the war-torn north. Dragons and mortals worked side by side in the rubble-filled streets, their combined efforts focused not on preparation for further conflict, but on the patient task of rebuilding what had been lost. The sight of a massive dragon using the precise control of flame to help mortal craftsmen forge new tools, while Nordic workers carefully tended to injuries sustained by their draconic partners, spoke of a cooperation that transcended the bitter divisions that had torn the rest of the continent apart. The leader of this remarkable community proved to be an elderly woman whose weathered features spoke of decades spent witnessing the worst that war could inflict upon the innocent. Yet her eyes held no trace of the bitterness or despair that marked so many survivors of the conflict. Instead, they reflected a quiet determination and a wisdom that seemed to echo the teachings Miraak had received from his own dragon mentors. Her name was Valdis, and her story unfolded like a legend that had somehow managed to take root in the harsh soil of reality. She had been present during some of the war's most brutal battles, had seen her own family torn apart by the cycle of violence and revenge that seemed to consume everything it touched. Yet rather than allowing these experiences to harden her heart against either dragons or mortals, she had chosen a different path. The turning point had come during a particularly savage engagement when she had witnessed a mortally wounded dragon fall from the sky into the courtyard of the temple where she had sought shelter. Rather than fleeing or attempting to finish off the great creature, something in its eyes had spoken to her of shared suffering and mutual loss. Against all logic, and certainly against all military strategy, she had tended to its wounds with the same care she would have shown to any injured person. That act of compassion had begun a transformation that spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The dragon, whose name was Vinteruth, had recovered from his injuries, but had chosen not to return to the aerial battles that raged overhead. Instead, he had remained to help protect the refugees who had gathered in the ruined temple, using his great strength not to rain destruction upon enemies, but to clear rubble and create shelter for the displaced and wounded. Word of this unprecedented cooperation had spread slowly but surely throughout the region, drawing others who had grown weary of the endless cycle of violence and revenge. Dragons who had lost faith in the possibility of victory through domination came to witness what Valdis and Vinteruth had created. Mortals who had seen too much death and destruction arrived seeking an alternative to the hatred that had consumed their former lives. What they had built together was more than just a refuge from the storm of war. It was a living demonstration of what could be achieved when the ancient partnership between dragon and mortal was guided by wisdom rather than pride. The community operated according to principles that seemed to have been drawn from the deepest wells of both draconic philosophy and human compassion, creating something entirely new yet somehow familiar to anyone who remembered the peaceful days before the conflict began. As Miraak listened to Valdis recount the history of their settlement, he began to recognize patterns that echoed the prophecies contained within the hidden archive. The spontaneous emergence of cooperation in the midst of seemingly hopeless conflict, the appearance of individuals whose actions transcended the limitations of their backgrounds, the gradual healing of wounds that had seemed beyond any possibility of recovery. These were all signs that the cosmic forces working toward balance and restoration had not been entirely overwhelmed by the chaos of war. Yet Valdis also spoke of challenges that threatened to undo everything they had accomplished. The settlement existed in a precarious balance, surrounded by factions on both sides who viewed their cooperation as a form of betrayal that needed to be eliminated. Raids by extremist groups had become increasingly frequent and violent, led by those who believed that any accommodation with former enemies represented an unforgivable weakness that prolonged the suffering of war. More troubling still were the reports of strange influences that seemed to be working actively to undermine any attempts at lasting peace. Valdis described encounters with figures who appeared to be ordinary refugees or deserters, but whose words carried a subtle poison that could turn the most reasonable discussions into bitter arguments. These individuals never remained long enough to be questioned closely, but their visits invariably left behind them a legacy of suspicion and discord that required weeks of patient effort to overcome. As Miraak absorbed these accounts, he began to recognize the handiwork of the same dark entities whose whispers he had learned to resist during his studies in the hidden archive. The forces of entropy that sought to prevent any restoration of cosmic balance were not content to work through grand gestures of destruction. They were equally willing to employ subtle manipulations that could poison hope at its very source. Yet the existence of Valdis's community also demonstrated that such influences could be resisted through the application of wisdom and determination. The bonds forged between dragons and mortals in this place had proven strong enough to withstand not only external attacks but also the more insidious assaults upon their unity from within. Their success offered a template that could potentially be replicated in other regions, creating a network of cooperation that might eventually tip the balance of the entire conflict toward peace. The dragon Vintruth proved to be a being of remarkable insight and patience, whose understanding of both his own kind and the mortals he had chosen to protect revealed depths of wisdom that impressed even Sarota. During long conversations that extended deep into the night, the two great creatures shared perspectives on the war that had never been voiced in any of the formal councils held by either side. Venturuth spoke of a growing weariness among the Dragon Lords, a recognition that the conflict had moved far beyond any rational hope of achieving their original objectives. Many of his kind had begun to question whether the partnership they sought to restore through domination could ever truly be rebuilt upon a foundation of fear and resentment. The victories they had won felt increasingly hollow, and the losses they had sustained seemed to diminish not just their numbers but their connection to the cosmic purposes they had once served with such clarity. These revelations filled Miraak with both hope and urgency. If the dragons themselves were beginning to recognize the futility of their current approach, then the opportunity for a different kind of resolution might be closer than anyone had realized. Yet the same factors that created this opportunity also made it fragile and temporary. The window for effective intervention might close as quickly as it had opened, especially if the forces working to perpetuate the conflict succeeded in preventing meaningful communication between the warring parties. As their time in the settlement drew to a close, Miraak felt that he was beginning to understand the true scope of his mission. His role was not simply to serve as a mediator between dragons and mortals, but to help weave together the threads of wisdom and compassion that already existed in scattered communities throughout the war zone. By connecting these isolated examples of cooperation and helping them share their insights and methods, it might be possible to create a movement toward peace that could grow beyond the reach of those who profited from continued conflict. The farewell ceremony conducted by the community combined elements of both draconic ritual and human tradition in ways that created something entirely new, yet deeply meaningful to all participants. As voices both great and small joined in harmonies that seemed to strengthen the very bonds they celebrated, Miraak felt a profound sense of connection to the deeper currents of destiny that flowed beneath the surface chaos of the world. The journey from Valdis's settlement took them deeper into the heart of the conflict zone, where the landscape bore witness to battles that had raged with increasing desperation as both sides sought decisive victories that remained perpetually beyond their grasp. Yet as they flew through skies that had once been filled with the thunder of combat, Miraak and his companions began to encounter signs that the war itself was undergoing a transformation as profound as any they had witnessed in the peaceful enclaves they had discovered. The change was subtle at first, visible only to eyes trained to perceive the deeper patterns that connected events across vast distances and extended periods of time. Where once the movements of armies had followed predictable cycles of advance and retreat, now there were hesitations and unexpected truces that spoke of a growing uncertainty among the leaders on both sides. Supply lines that should have been maintained at all costs were being abandoned, while strategic positions that had been fought over for months were suddenly left undefended as their occupants simply melted away into the countryside. Sarota, whose ancient eyes had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, was the first to recognize what they were observing. The war was not ending through victory or defeat, but through a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue or depletion of resources. The very foundations upon which the conflict had been built were beginning to erode as participants on both sides started to question the assumptions that had driven them to take up arms in the first place. This realization led them to seek out the sources of this transformation, following rumors and half-glimpsed movements toward regions where the fighting had reportedly ceased not through conquest but through something far more mysterious. What they discovered in these places challenged their understanding of how conflicts could be resolved and offered new hope for the mission they had undertaken. In a valley that had been the site of some of the war's most brutal engagements, they found a gathering unlike anything recorded in the histories of either species. Dragons and mortals sat together in circles that expanded outward from a central fire like ripples on a peaceful pond, their voices joining in conversations that seemed to heal wounds both visible and hidden. The participants were not diplomats or leaders, but ordinary soldiers and citizens who had simply grown weary of the hatred that had consumed their lives for so many years. The gatherings had begun spontaneously, without planning or coordination from any central authority. A dragon wounded and grounded during a particularly savage battle had been discovered by a group of human refugees seeking shelter in the same cave system. Rather than completing the cycle of violence that had brought them to that moment, something in their shared suffering had sparked a recognition that transcended the barriers of species and allegiance. From that initial encounter, word had spread through networks that existed beneath the awareness of military commanders and political leaders. Deserters from both armies, civilians displaced by the fighting, even occasional officers who had lost faith in their orders, began to make pilgrimages to valleys and hidden places where these spontaneous peace gatherings took root and flourished. What Miraak witnessed in these assemblies was the organic emergence of wisdom that echoed the deepest teachings he had received in the temples of Solstheim. Without formal instruction in philosophy or theology, ordinary beings who had experienced the worst that war could inflict were rediscovering the fundamental truths that connected all conscious life. Their conversations moved naturally toward topics of forgiveness and understanding, while their shared activities focused on healing and reconstruction rather than preparation for further conflict. Yet even as these developments filled him with hope, Miraak also began to perceive the challenges that threatened to undermine what was being achieved. The spontaneous nature of the peace gatherings, while representing their greatest strength, also made them vulnerable to disruption from forces that understood how to exploit their lack of formal organization and protection. During their third day in the valley, such a threat materialized with a suddenness that caught even Sarota's experienced senses off guard. A group of figures approached the gathering under the guise of seeking refuge from the fighting, but their presence brought with it an atmosphere of discord that began to poison the harmony that had taken weeks to establish. The newcomers spoke eloquently of justice and the need to remember the wrongs that had been committed by former enemies. Their words carried a seductive logic that seemed to promise a more complete form of peace built upon acknowledgement of past grievances and appropriate compensation for suffered losses. Yet beneath the surface reasonableness of their arguments lay something that made the very air feel cold and lifeless. Miraak recognized the signs immediately from his studies in the hidden archive. These were not ordinary soldiers or refugees, but agents of the entropic forces that fed upon conflict and sought to prevent any genuine resolution of the crisis. Their mission was not to restart the fighting directly, but to introduce elements of doubt and suspicion that would cause the peace gathering to collapse from within. The test that followed challenged everything Miraak had learned about the nature of wisdom and the application of power. The traditional response would have been to expose the infiltrators through force, using his mastery of the Thu'um to reveal their true nature and drive them away. Yet such an approach would have validated the very attitudes of domination and coercion that the peace gathering sought to transcend. Instead, Miraak chose a different path, one that required him to trust in the wisdom that had already begun to emerge among the gathered dragons and mortals. Rather than confronting the agents of discord directly, he began to speak quietly with individual participants about the nature of the challenge they faced. He shared insights drawn from ancient texts about how destructive influences operated, while always emphasizing that the power to resist them lay not in his abilities, but in their own collective understanding. The response that emerged was more beautiful and effective than any military strategy could have achieved. As awareness of the threat spread through the gathering, participants began to surround the agents of discord, not with hostility, but with a kind of gentle persistence that made their negative influence impossible to maintain. Conversations that had been turning toward bitterness were consciously redirected toward understanding, while activities that might have become divisive were transformed into opportunities for cooperation. Faced with this unified but non-violent resistance, the infiltrators found their power dissolving like shadows before the dawn. Unable to create the discord they required to accomplish their mission, they withdrew from the gathering as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind them no legacy of suspicion or renewed conflict. The successful resolution of this crisis marked a turning point, not just for the peace gathering, but for Miraak's understanding of his own role in the larger patterns of destiny. He began to see that his purpose was not to impose solutions through the application of superior power, but to help nurture the wisdom that already existed within communities and individuals. The Thu'um he had mastered was most effective when used not as a weapon or tool of domination, but as a means of amplifying voices that might otherwise go unheard. As word of what had transpired in the valley spread through the underground networks that connected the various peace gatherings, a new phase of the movement began to emerge. Communities that had been isolated began to establish regular communication with one another, sharing methods and insights that strengthened their ability to resist both external attacks and internal subversion. Miraak found himself drawn into a role that felt both natural and unprecedented, serving as a living bridge between scattered groups while helping to weave their individual efforts into something approaching a coordinated movement. Yet this coordination emerged organically from the grassroots level rather than being imposed from above, creating a resilience that formal organizations could never have achieved. The dragons who participated in these gatherings began to share knowledge that had been jealously guarded for centuries, teaching mortals aspects of the Thu'um that had previously been considered too dangerous or sacred for non-draconic minds. In return, they learned from human insights about adaptation and innovation that complemented their own ancient wisdom in ways that surprised them with their effectiveness. Through the late summer months, as the traditional fighting season approached its peak, reports began to reach military commanders on both sides that their armies were simply dissolving. Not through defeat or destruction, but through a kind of gentle transformation that left former soldiers more interested in rebuilding than in continuing to fight. Weapons were abandoned, not in retreat, but in a conscious choice to pursue different approaches to resolving the conflicts that had driven them to war. The implications of these developments were not lost on the remaining leadership of either faction. Emergency councils were convened to address what many viewed as a crisis more threatening than any military defeat. Yet even within these councils, voices began to emerge that questioned whether what they were witnessing represented a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be embraced. As autumn approached and Miraak reflected upon the changes he had witnessed and helped to nurture, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment, tempered by awareness that the most challenging phases of the transformation still lay ahead. The organic peace movement had demonstrated that alternatives to violence were not only possible, but remarkably effective when approached with wisdom and patience. Yet the forces that profited from continued conflict had not been idle, and their response to these developments would test everything that had been achieved in ways that would require even greater reserves of understanding and determination. As the leaves turned gold and crimson across the northern reaches of Tamriel, Miraak began to sense stirrings in the deepest foundations of reality itself, as if powers that had slumbered since the world's creation were slowly awakening to observe the transformation taking place upon its surface. The air carried whispers in languages that predated the division between dragon and mortal tongues, while the aurora borealis appeared with increasing frequency even during the daylight hours, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any known vocabulary. The peace gatherings that had sprouted throughout the war zone were no longer isolated phenomena, but interconnected nodes in a vast network of understanding that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Miraak moved through this network like a gardener tending to a miraculous crop, his presence helping to strengthen connections while nurturing the growth of wisdom in places where it had never been expected to take root. Yet it was during this period of apparent triumph that he began to encounter manifestations of power that went far beyond anything described in the teachings of his dragon mentors or the ancient texts of the hidden archive. The Thu'um that had once required conscious effort and careful modulation now flowed from him as naturally as breathing, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies upon which reality itself was constructed. The first sign of this transformation came during a particularly challenging meditation session in the ruins of an ancient temple that had been sacred to both dragons and mortals in the days before the war. As Miraak sought to center himself amid the broken stones and scarred walls, he became aware that his voice was creating effects that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of his physical form. Each syllable of the dragon tongue that passed his lips seemed to ripple outward through dimensions that existed parallel to the mortal realm, touching places where thought and manifestation were indistinguishable from one another. The broken stones around him began to resonate in harmony with his words, their ancient surfaces glowing with a gentle light that spoke of memories awakening after centuries of dormancy. But more remarkable still was the response that came from the network of peace gatherings scattered across the continent. Participants in communities hundreds of miles away reported experiencing simultaneous moments of profound clarity and unity, as if they had been touched by a presence that somehow encompassed them all while remaining beyond their individual understanding. Sarota, whose knowledge of draconic lore was encyclopedic, recognized what was occurring with a mixture of wonder and concern that reflected the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The Thu'um that Miraak was learning to wield was not simply an advanced form of the dragon shouts that had been passed down through generations of priests and scholars. It was something far more fundamental, a direct connection to the creative forces that had spoken the world into existence at the beginning of time. The ancient texts spoke of such abilities appearing only in beings whose souls had achieved perfect resonance with the cosmic patterns that governed all existence. These individuals became living conduits for energies that could reshape not just the physical world, but the underlying structures of reality itself. Yet the same sources that described this power also warned of the terrible responsibility that came with its manifestation. As Miraak's abilities continued to expand, he found himself capable of perceiving the world from perspectives that no mortal mind had ever been designed to accommodate. He could see the threads of cause and effect that connected every action to its ultimate consequences, observe the flows of energy that bound all conscious beings into a vast web of interdependence, and sense the presence of entities that existed in dimensions beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Through these expanded senses, he became aware that the peace movement they had nurtured was creating ripples that extended far beyond the immediate cessation of hostilities between dragons and mortals. The harmony being established in the war-torn regions was actually helping to repair damage that had been inflicted upon the fundamental structure of reality itself, healing wounds in the cosmic order that had been festering since the conflict began. Yet this same expanded awareness also revealed the presence of forces that viewed such healing as a direct threat to their own existence. The entities that fed upon discord and chaos were not content to simply observe the restoration of balance from a distance. They began to manifest more directly in the mortal realm, taking forms that could influence events with increasing boldness and sophistication. The first major confrontation came when Miraak was visiting a peace gathering that had been established in the ruins of what had once been Skyrim's greatest library. The assembled dragons and mortals had been working together to recover and preserve texts that contained irreplaceable knowledge about the early partnership between their species when the very air around them began to thicken with malevolent presence. The attack, when it came, was unlike anything that traditional military thinking could have prepared them to face. Rather than physical violence, the assault took the form of a wave of despair so profound that it threatened to drain all meaning from their efforts at reconciliation. Participants found themselves overwhelmed by visions of past tragedies and future catastrophes, their hope replaced by a crushing certainty that all their work was futile in the face of inevitable suffering and loss. Yet Miraak had been preparing for precisely such a moment through months of meditation and study. As the wave of despair crashed over the gathering, he responded not with defensive measures, but with a Thu'um that seemed to emerge from the deepest wells of creation itself. His voice carried frequencies that resonated with the fundamental harmonies underlying all existence, creating a sanctuary of clarity and peace that allowed the assembled beings to remember why they had chosen cooperation over conflict. The battle that followed was fought not on any physical plane, but in the realm of pure intention, where the forces of entropy and creation met in direct opposition. Miraak found himself drawing upon sources of power that he had not known existed within him, channeling energies that flowed through him from dimensions where time and space held no meaning. The outcome was not a victory in any traditional sense, but rather a demonstration that the principles of harmony and understanding possessed their own inherent strength when applied with sufficient wisdom and determination. The entities that had sought to destroy the peace gathering found their attacks neutralized not through superior force, but through the simple persistence of compassion in the face of malevolence. As the confrontation reached its resolution, something unprecedented occurred. The very fabric of reality in the immediate vicinity began to shift and strengthen, as if the successful resistance to entropy had actually reversed some of the damage that had been accumulating since the beginning of the cosmic crisis. The ruins around them took on a luminescence that spoke of renewal, while the air itself seemed to sing with harmonies that had not been heard since the earliest days of creation. Word of this event spread through the network of peace gatherings with a speed that defied conventional explanation, carried not by messengers, but by something that resembled a collective awakening of consciousness. Communities that had been struggling with their own manifestations of discord suddenly found themselves possessed of new strength and clarity, while individuals who had been wavering in their commitment to peaceful resolution discovered reserves of determination they had not known they possessed. Yet even as these developments filled Miraak with a sense of accomplishment that went beyond personal satisfaction, he also became aware of stirrings in the deepest foundations of reality that suggested the true test of what they had achieved still lay ahead. The forces they had confronted were not the ultimate source of the cosmic imbalance, but merely its advance agents. Somewhere in the spaces between worlds, powers of unimaginable magnitude were beginning to take notice of the changes occurring in the mortal realm. The dragons who had witnessed Miraak's demonstration of transcendent Thu'um began to speak among themselves in voices too low for mortal ears to comprehend, their conversations touching upon prophecies and possibilities that had been theoretical abstractions until this moment. Some spoke of hope that had seemed impossible just months before, while others expressed concerns about forces that might be awakened by the very success of their peaceful efforts. As winter approached once again, bringing with it the season when the veil between dimensions grew thinnest, Miraak prepared himself for challenges that would test not just his growing mastery of cosmic forces, but the very foundations of his understanding about the nature of existence itself. The peace they had nurtured was no longer just a local phenomenon, but a catalyst for changes that would ripple through realms beyond mortal comprehension, carrying with them both the promise of ultimate harmony and the risk of unleashing powers that might prove impossible to control. The approach of winter brought with it a convergence of forces both visible and hidden, as if the turning of the seasons had triggered mechanisms that had been waiting dormant since the beginning of time itself. Across the continent, the network of peace gatherings that had grown from scattered seeds of hope into a vast web of interconnected communities began to pulse with a unified rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of creation itself. Miraak found himself drawn to the center of this convergence, not through any conscious decision, but by currents of destiny that flowed with the inevitability of rivers finding the sea. His journey took him to a place that existed on no mortal maps, a valley hidden deep within the mountains of eastern Skyrim, where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms had grown so thin as to be almost meaningless. The valley itself was a marvel that defied conventional understanding of geography and natural law. Ancient trees whose roots seemed to extend into dimensions beyond the mortal plane stood sentinel around a lake whose waters reflected not just the sky above, but glimpses of other worlds and other times. The very air hummed with energies that made the aurora borealis appear as a constant canopy overhead, painting everything in shifting hues that had no names in any earthly language. It was here that the greatest dragons and the wisest mortals from across Tamriel had begun to gather, drawn by the same inexplicable currents that had brought Miraak to this sacred place. Yet these were not formal delegations or organized assemblies, but rather beings who had somehow been selected by forces beyond their conscious awareness to participate in something that transcended all previous attempts at resolution. Paarthurnax, the ancient dragon, whose wisdom was legendary even among his own kind, had arrived from his mountain refuge, carrying knowledge that had been preserved through countless ages of conflict and change. His presence brought with it a gravity that seemed to anchor the gathering in purposes that reached back to the fundamental decisions made at the world's creation. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of millennia spent contemplating the deepest mysteries of existence. Alongside the great dragons came mortals whose names had become legend in their own right, though many had labored in obscurity until the cosmic currents began to stir. Ysgramma himself appeared, no longer the vengeful warrior of historical memory, but transformed by experiences that had taught him the true cost of endless conflict. His presence spoke of redemption and the possibility that even the deepest wounds could be healed when approached with sufficient understanding. Among the assembled beings, Miraak recognized individuals whose paths had intersected with his own during the months of building the peace network. Valdise was there, her weathered face glowing with a contentment that came from seeing her small acts of compassion ripple outward into movements that had changed the course of history. The dragon Vidrus soared overhead in lazy circles, his presence serving as a bridge between the aerial conferences of his kind and the ground-based discussions of the mortals. Yet the most remarkable aspect of this gathering was not the fame or power of its participants, but the quality of harmony that seemed to emanate from their collective presence. Dragons and mortals moved among each other with a natural ease that spoke of barriers dissolved and ancient fears finally laid to rest. Conversations flowed between species with the same fluidity that characterized discussions among old friends, while collaborative efforts emerged spontaneously without need for formal coordination or leadership. As the days passed, Miraak began to understand that they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new in the history of Tamriel. This was not simply the end of a war, or even the restoration of an ancient partnership, but the emergence of a form of consciousness that transcended the limitations of individual species and perspectives. The gathered beings were becoming something greater than the sum of their parts, a collective intelligence that could perceive solutions to problems that had seemed intractable when approached from any single point of view. The discussions that took place in the valley touched upon subjects that ranged from the immediately practical to the cosmically abstract. Plans were laid for the integration of dragon wisdom and mortal innovation in ways that would benefit both societies, while simultaneously exploring philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and the purpose of existence itself. Yet all these conversations were united by an underlying current of understanding that seemed to flow from sources beyond rational analysis. It was during these exchanges that Miraak began to sense the presence of entities whose attention was focused upon their gathering with an intensity that bordered on the physical. These were not the chaotic forces that had opposed their peace efforts, but rather beings of such vast intelligence and benevolent purpose that mortal minds could barely grasp the edges of their consciousness. The first direct manifestation came during a moment of particularly profound harmony, when the voices of all the assembled beings had joined in a Thu'um that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. The air around them began to shimmer with possibilities, while patterns of light appeared that spoke in languages older than words. Through these manifestations, the gathered dragons and mortals received communications from entities that identified themselves as the original architects of the cosmic order. Beings who had withdrawn from direct involvement in mortal affairs eons ago, but who had been watching the development of the crisis with growing concern. Their message was both reassuring and sobering, confirming that the peace movement had indeed begun to heal damage inflicted upon reality itself, while also warning of challenges that still lay ahead. The cosmic order, they explained, depended upon a delicate balance between forces of creation and entropy, stability and change, individual consciousness and collective harmony. The war between dragons and mortals had disrupted this balance in ways that threatened the integrity of existence itself, creating opportunities for entities of pure chaos to gain footholds in the ordered universe. Yet the same crisis that had brought such danger had also created opportunities for evolution that would never have existed in times of perfect stability. The synthesis of dragon wisdom and mortal innovation that was emerging from the peace gatherings represented a new form of consciousness that could serve as a more effective guardian of cosmic balance than either species had been able to achieve in isolation. The communications from these cosmic entities came with offers of knowledge and power that could accelerate the healing process and strengthen the defenses against future incursions of chaos. Yet they also emphasized that such gifts could only be received by beings who had demonstrated their commitment to harmony over domination, service over self-interest, and wisdom over mere power. As Miraak absorbed these revelations, he felt a profound sense of responsibility settling upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and ancient purpose. The Thu'um that had been growing within him was not simply an advanced form of dragon magic, but a direct connection to the creative forces that maintained the structure of reality itself. His role in the cosmic order was to serve as a living bridge between the mortal realm and dimensions of existence that most minds could not even conceptualize. Yet even as these cosmic purposes became clear, the gathering in the valley began to perceive stirrings of opposition that went beyond anything they had faced during their previous confrontations with chaotic forces. The very success of their efforts had attracted attention from entities whose power dwarfed the local manifestations of entropy they had overcome. beings of such destructive potential that their direct intervention in mortal affairs could unravel the fabric of existence itself. The first signs of this new threat appeared as subtle distortions in the flow of time and space around the valley. Conversations would suddenly become confused as participants found themselves responding to words that had not yet been spoken, while movements through the physical landscape began to follow paths that led to destinations other than those intended. The dragons, with their ancient sensitivity to cosmic rhythms, were the first to recognize what they were experiencing. The fundamental laws that governed cause and effect were being systematically undermined, creating conditions where coherent thought and purposeful action would become increasingly difficult to maintain. This was not a direct attack that could be resisted through strength or wisdom, but rather a gradual dissolution of the very foundations upon which consciousness itself depended. Yet even as this realization brought with it a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation, the gathered beings discovered that their collective consciousness possessed resources that none of them had suspected. The harmony they had achieved was not merely emotional or philosophical, but had actually created new pathways of connection that allowed them to pool their understanding and abilities in ways that transcended the normal limitations of individual minds. Through these connections, they began to perceive solutions to the crisis that would have been impossible for any single being to conceive. The Thu'um that had been awakening within Miraak was revealed to be not a unique gift, but rather the manifestation of a potential that existed within the collective consciousness they had created. By harmonizing their voices and intentions, they could access levels of creative power that matched or even exceeded the destructive forces arrayed against them. As the days shortened and the cosmic crisis deepened, the gathering in the valley prepared to undertake a working of Thu'um that would either restore the cosmic balance or risk the complete dissolution of ordered reality. The stakes could not have been higher, yet the beings assembled in that sacred place faced the approaching challenge with a serenity that came from knowing they had found something worth preserving, regardless of the personal cost such preservation might require. The moment of ultimate decision arrived with the winter solstice, when the boundaries between dimensions reached their annual minimum and the forces of chaos seized upon this opportunity to launch their most devastating assault upon the foundations of ordered reality. Yet the cosmic entities that had been observing the gathering had prepared them for precisely this eventuality, sharing knowledge that allowed the assembled beings to transform what should have been their most vulnerable moment into their greatest strength. As darkness reached its deepest point on the longest night of the year, the valley began to resonate with harmonies that seemed to emerge from the very bedrock beneath their feet. The lake at the center of the gathering reflected not just the aurora borealis overhead, but glimpses of other dimensions where the battle for cosmic balance was being fought on scales that dwarfed any conflict in recorded history. Miraak found himself at the center of a formation that included the greatest dragons and wisest mortals from across Tamriel, their voices joining his in a Thu'um that reached beyond individual words to touch the fundamental frequencies upon which existence itself was constructed. Yet this was not a demonstration of power in any conventional sense, but rather an act of collective creation that sought to heal rather than destroy, to unite rather than conquer. The opposition they faced manifested not as visible enemies, but as a presence of such overwhelming negation that it threatened to drain all meaning from their efforts before they could be completed. The very air around them began to writhe with contradictions that made coherent thought increasingly difficult, while the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift between states of existence that defied all natural law. Yet the months of preparation and the bonds forged through countless acts of cooperation had created something stronger than any individual will or ability. As the forces of chaos pressed against their collective consciousness, the gathered beings discovered that their unity allowed them to maintain clarity and purpose even in the face of absolute contradiction. The Thu'um that emerged from their combined voices was unlike anything that had ever been heard in the mortal realm. It carried within it not just the ancient wisdom of dragons or the innovative spirit of mortals, but a synthesis of both that created entirely new possibilities for existence. Each syllable spoke realities into being that had never existed before, while simultaneously healing wounds in the cosmic order that had festered since the beginning of time. The response from the forces of chaos was immediate and overwhelming, as entities of pure entropy attempted to silence the creative chorus before it could complete its work. The assault came not just from the dimensions beyond mortal perception, but from within the gathering itself, as doubt and despair sought to undermine the unity that made their efforts possible. It was in this moment of ultimate trial that Miraak's true purpose became clear. The Thu'um that had been growing within him was not meant to serve as a weapon against their enemies, but as a foundation that could support the creative efforts of all the gathered beings. His voice became the root note around which all other harmonies could organize themselves, providing stability that allowed even the most complex workings to proceed without faltering. Through him flowed not just his own understanding, but the collective wisdom of everyone who had participated in the peace gatherings throughout the year. Every act of cooperation, every moment of forgiveness, every choice of understanding over hatred had contributed to a reservoir of positive energy that now poured forth in a torrent of creative force. The battle that followed was fought on levels of reality that mortal language lacks the capacity to describe adequately. Concepts themselves became weapons as the forces of order and chaos met in direct confrontation, while the very notion of existence hung in the balance between continuation and dissolution. Yet through it all, the core of harmony that the gathering had created remained stable, providing an anchor point around which new forms of reality could crystallize. The turning point came when the assembled beings realized that their opposition was not truly external to themselves, but rather represented aspects of existence that had become separated from the whole through eons of conflict and misunderstanding. The forces of chaos were not alien invaders, but rather parts of the cosmic order that had forgotten their proper relationship to the greater harmony. This realization transformed their approach from resistance to integration as they began to weave the chaotic energies into patterns that served creation rather than destruction. The Thu'um that had been a chorus of opposition became a symphony of inclusion, making space for discordant elements while transforming them through their integration into the greater whole. The resolution, when it came, was both climactic and surprisingly gentle. Rather than the explosive conclusion that might have been expected from such a momentous confrontation, the crisis simply dissolved as the fundamental contradictions that had driven it were resolved through understanding. The forces that had seemed so threatening revealed themselves to be aspects of existence that could serve beneficial purposes when properly integrated into the cosmic order. As the longest night finally gave way to dawn, the beings gathered in the valley found themselves changed in ways that went far beyond their individual transformations. They had become part of something larger than themselves, a collective consciousness that could perceive and respond to cosmic patterns that had previously been beyond mortal comprehension. The immediate effects of their success were visible throughout the surrounding landscape, as the valley itself began to transform into something that resembled the primordial paradise described in the oldest creation myths. Trees that had been bare for the winter suddenly burst into bloom, while the lake began to sing with voices that spoke of joy and renewal. Yet the most profound changes were those that could not be seen, but only felt, as the fundamental tone of existence itself shifted toward greater harmony and stability. Across Tamriel and beyond, beings sensitive to cosmic currents began to report a sense of relief and renewal that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of reality. The dragons who had participated in the Great Working found that their ancient loneliness had been healed through connection to the collective consciousness that had emerged from their cooperation with mortals. No longer were they isolated guardians of wisdom that none could truly share, but partners in an ongoing creation that drew strength from diversity rather than being weakened by it. The mortals discovered that their participation in the cosmic order had not diminished their individuality, but rather had revealed new dimensions of their own potential. The brief lives that had once seemed insignificant in the face of eternity were revealed to possess unique perspectives and capabilities that were essential to the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. Miraak, standing at the center of these transformations, felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond personal satisfaction to touch something fundamental about the nature of purpose and fulfillment. The Thu'um that had awakened within him was no longer his alone, but had become part of the greater symphony of existence, adding its voice to harmonies that would continue to unfold throughout all future ages. As the first light of the new day painted the valley in colors that seemed to have been born from pure joy, the assembled beings began to disperse back to their various homes and communities. Yet they carried with them not just memories of what they had experienced, but ongoing connections to the collective consciousness that would allow them to continue the work of integration and healing wherever their paths might lead them. The war between dragons and mortals had ended not through victory or defeat, but through a transformation so profound that the very concepts that had driven the conflict no longer held meaning. In their place had emerged new forms of relationship and understanding that promised to guide the evolution of consciousness toward ever greater expressions of harmony and wisdom. In the months that followed the Great Convergence, the world experienced a transformation so profound yet subtle that many beings living through it could hardly believe the magnitude of what had changed. The valley where the cosmic working had taken place became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking to understand the new form of consciousness that was emerging across Tamriel, though the journey there was not one that could be accomplished through ordinary travel alone. The peace that settled over the former war zones was not merely the absence of conflict, but something far more positive and generative. Where battlefields had once scarred the landscape, communities began to emerge that embodied the synthesis of dragon wisdom and mortal innovation in ways that created entirely new possibilities for existence. These settlements bore no resemblance to the rigid hierarchies that had characterized both the dragon cult and the human kingdoms, but rather operated according to principles that allowed individual creativity to flourish within frameworks of collective harmony. Miraak found himself drawn into a role that had no precedent in recorded history, serving as a living bridge between the transformed consciousness that had emerged from the convergence and the broader populations that were still adjusting to the new reality. His presence had a calming effect that went beyond mere charisma or authority, carrying with it resonances of the cosmic harmony that had been achieved during the winter solstice working. Yet even as he moved through this transformed world, Miraak remained grounded in the humble service that had characterized his earliest days as a temple priest. He would spend hours sitting with individuals who struggled to understand their place in the new order, offering guidance that drew not from his unique abilities, but from deep wells of compassion that seemed to connect directly to the source of existence itself. The dragons who had participated in the Great Working underwent their own profound transformations as the ancient isolation that had defined their existence for millennia gave way to connections that enriched rather than diminished their essential nature. They began to establish new forms of relationship with mortal communities that went far beyond the teacher-student dynamics that had characterized the old dragon cult. Parthenax, whose wisdom had been instrumental in guiding the convergence, became something like an elder statesman for this emerging new world. His mountain retreat was transformed into a center of learning where beings from across Tamriel could come to explore the implications of the consciousness shift that had taken place. The ancient dragon's voice, when raised in Thu'um, now carried harmonics that could heal not just physical ailments, but the spiritual wounds that had accumulated over generations of conflict. The mortal participants in the convergence returned to their communities carrying seeds of transformation that began to sprout in ways that defied all prediction or control. Simple farmers discovered within themselves abilities to communicate with the natural world that allowed them to coax abundance from even the most barren soil. Craftsmen found that their work began to embody qualities of beauty and functionality that seemed to emerge from sources beyond their conscious skill. Yet, perhaps the most remarkable changes occurred among the children born in the aftermath of the convergence. These young beings displayed from their earliest days a natural facility with forms of consciousness that integrated multiple perspectives simultaneously. They could speak with dragons as easily as with their own parents, while their play often involved creating collaborative works of art and music that seemed to channel harmonies from dimensions beyond the mortal realm. Valdis, whose small community had served as one of the early examples of cooperation between former enemies, found herself overwhelmed by the number of pilgrims who sought to learn from her experience. Yet rather than attempting to replicate the specific conditions that had led to her success, she focused on helping visitors understand the underlying principles of compassion and patience that could be applied in any circumstances. The network of peace gatherings that had played such a crucial role in building toward the convergence began to evolve into something resembling permanent institutions, though they retained the organic flexibility that had made them effective in the first place. These centers became focal points for ongoing exploration of the new forms of consciousness that were emerging, while also serving practical functions as places where conflicts could be resolved before they escalated into violence. The Thu'um itself underwent a transformation that reflected the broader changes taking place throughout society. Where once it had been primarily associated with power over external forces, it now became understood as a tool for facilitating communication and understanding between different forms of consciousness. Children learned to use simple forms of the Thu'um to comfort injured animals or help plants grow more vibrantly, while adults applied more complex applications to resolve disputes and coordinate community projects. Miraak's own relationship with the Thu'um continued to deepen in ways that sometimes surprised even him. During moments of particularly profound meditation, he would find his voice expressing harmonies that seemed to emerge from the fundamental structure of reality itself. These spontaneous compositions had effects that rippled far beyond their immediate auditory range, creating conditions that supported healing and growth wherever their vibrations reached. Yet even as these positive developments unfolded across the transformed landscape, the cosmic forces that had been rebalanced during the convergence required ongoing attention and nurturing to maintain their new configuration. More importantly, the deeper patterns of consciousness that had made the conflict possible in the first place needed to be transformed through patient education and example. The challenges that emerged during this period were subtle but significant, requiring approaches that drew upon all the wisdom that had been gained through the long journey toward reconciliation. Some communities struggled with the transition from hierarchical structures to more fluid forms of organization, while individuals occasionally found themselves overwhelmed by the expanded awareness that came with participation in the collective consciousness. Miraak responded to these challenges with the same patient understanding that had characterized his approach throughout the peace-building process. He worked to establish support systems that could help beings navigate the transition without losing their sense of individual identity, while simultaneously creating frameworks that allowed the collective consciousness to continue evolving in directions that served the highest good of all. The seasons that followed the convergence brought with them a steady accumulation of small miracles that transformed daily life in ways both profound and practical. Diseases that had plagued communities for generations began to heal spontaneously, while natural disasters that might once have caused widespread devastation were mitigated through the coordinated efforts of dragons and mortals working in harmony. Yet perhaps the most significant changes were those that occurred in the realm of relationships between individuals and communities. The fear and suspicion that had driven the original conflict gave way to forms of trust and cooperation that allowed for unprecedented levels of collaboration and mutual support. Conflicts that arose were resolved through dialogue and understanding rather than force, while differences of opinion became sources of creative tension that generated new insights and innovations. As the first anniversary of the convergence approached, Miraak found himself reflecting upon the journey that had brought them to this transformed world. The young priest who had first heard whispers of destiny in the temple halls of Solstheim seemed like a figure from another lifetime. Yet he could trace the threads of continuity that connected his current role to those humble beginnings. The Thu'um that had awakened within him was no longer a personal ability, but had become part of the greater symphony of consciousness that connected all beings who participated in the new reality. His voice added its harmonies to a chorus that included not just the dragons and mortals of Tamriel, but entities from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, all working together to support the ongoing evolution of existence itself. The peace that had been achieved was not a static condition, but a dynamic process that required constant creativity and adaptation. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities for growth, while the collective consciousness that had emerged from the convergence continued to explore new possibilities for expression and service. As he stood in the valley where the great working had taken place, watching the aurora borealis dance overhead in patterns that seemed to celebrate the harmony that had been achieved, Miraak felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had led to this moment. The future stretched ahead like an infinite canvas waiting for new forms of beauty to be painted upon its surface, and he knew that the work of creation and healing would continue for as long as consciousness itself endured. The deeper understanding that emerged in the second year following the convergence revealed truths that had been hidden not through deliberate concealment, but because the consciousness required to perceive them had not previously existed in the mortal realm. As the collective awareness that connected dragons and mortals continued to mature and stabilize, it began to unlock mysteries that had puzzled even the most ancient beings since the beginning of recorded time. Miraak found himself serving as a conduit for revelations that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of existence itself. During his meditations in the sacred valley, visions would unfold that showed him the true history of Tamriel and the cosmic forces that had shaped its development across eons of apparent separation and conflict. These insights came not as abstract knowledge, but as lived experiences that allowed him to understand from within the perspectives of beings whose existence spanned dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. The first of these profound revelations concerned the nature of the Dragon War itself, which was revealed to have been not a random outbreak of violence but rather a necessary phase in the evolution of consciousness that had been anticipated and prepared for by cosmic entities whose wisdom encompassed the entirety of existence. The suffering and destruction that had marked the conflict were real and tragic, yet they had also served as catalysts for developments that could not have occurred through any gentler means. This understanding brought with it a complex mixture of sorrow and acceptance, as Miraak came to recognize that the pain experienced by countless beings during the war had not been meaningless, but had contributed to the emergence of forms of consciousness that could serve as guardians of cosmic balance for ages to come. The synthesis of dragon wisdom and mortal innovation that had been achieved through their reconciliation represented an evolutionary leap that elevated both species beyond their previous limitations. Yet even more profound was the revelation of his own role in patterns that extended far beyond the immediate crisis that had been resolved. The Thu'um that had awakened within him was shown to be part of a cosmic instrument of such vast scope and purpose that mortal minds could barely grasp its periphery. He was not unique in possessing such abilities, but rather one of many beings across multiple dimensions and timelines who served as focal points for the creative forces that maintained the structure of reality itself. Through visions that unfolded with crystalline clarity, Miraak witnessed the work of other Dragonborn who had appeared at crucial moments throughout the history of existence, each one serving as a bridge between different forms of consciousness when the cosmic balance required such intervention. Some had succeeded in their missions and passed into dimensions beyond mortal awareness, while others had fallen to temptations that had transformed them into instruments of the very chaos they had been meant to oppose. The pattern that emerged from these revelations was both inspiring and sobering, showing how the cosmic order maintained itself through the willing service of beings who chose to transcend their individual limitations in service of something greater than themselves. Yet it also revealed how easily such service could be corrupted when the beings involved allowed pride or the desire for power to compromise their connection to the source of their abilities. As these understandings deepened, Miraak began to perceive currents of possibility that suggested his own journey was far from complete. The convergence and the subsequent transformation of consciousness represented not an ending, but rather a new beginning, the establishment of a foundation upon which even greater works of creation and healing could be built. The Thu'um that flowed through him was continuing to evolve, developing capabilities that went beyond anything he had previously imagined possible. The dragons who had become his closest collaborators in maintaining the new reality began to share their own expanded perceptions, revealing how their participation in the collective consciousness had awakened memories that stretched back to the very origins of their species. They spoke of times before time, when they had existed as pure expressions of cosmic will, serving as the voice through which the fundamental forces of creation spoke the universe into existence. These ancient memories carried with them knowledge of techniques and possibilities that had been forgotten during the long ages when dragons and mortals had existed in separation. The Thu'um was revealed to be not merely a tool for effecting change in the physical world, but a direct connection to the creative forces that could reshape reality at its most fundamental levels. Yet with this expanded understanding came renewed awareness of the responsibilities that accompanied such power. The entities that had opposed their efforts during the convergence had not been destroyed but merely transformed, integrated into the new cosmic order in ways that served creation rather than destruction. However, the underlying tensions that had given rise to those conflicts remained present in the structure of existence itself, requiring constant vigilance and wisdom to prevent their reemergence in more dangerous forms. The collective consciousness that had emerged from the convergence began to explore these challenges through forms of communication that transcended individual minds, creating shared experiences that allowed all participants to understand the full complexity of what they were dealing with. Through these explorations, new approaches to maintaining cosmic balance began to emerge that drew upon resources and perspectives that no single being could have developed in isolation. Miraak's role in these explorations was both central and humble, as he served as a focal point for communications that connected the collective consciousness to sources of wisdom that existed beyond the boundaries of any single dimension or timeline. The Thu'um that flowed through him during these sessions carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies upon which all existence depended, creating conditions that supported understanding and growth even when dealing with the most challenging and paradoxical aspects of reality. The revelations that emerged through these collaborative explorations touched upon subjects that ranged from the practical to the transcendent. Plans began to take shape for extending the consciousness transformation beyond Tamriel to other regions and dimensions where similar conflicts and imbalances threatened the stability of existence. Yet these plans were balanced by equally important work focused on deepening and stabilizing the changes that had already been achieved. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, the beings who participated in the collective consciousness began to perceive themselves as part of a vast network that connected conscious entities across multiple levels of reality. Their individual experiences and perspectives remained unique and valuable, yet they were also part of something larger that could respond to challenges and opportunities with wisdom and effectiveness that far exceeded the capabilities of any single mind. The children, who had been born in the aftermath of the convergence, continued to display remarkable abilities that suggested the consciousness transformation was becoming a permanent feature of existence rather than a temporary aberration. These young beings served as bridges between the old reality and the new, helping their elders understand and adapt to ways of being that came naturally to those who had never known the limitations of separated consciousness. Through his interactions with these children, Miraak began to understand that his own role was evolving from that of an active agent of change to something more like a guardian and teacher, helping to preserve and transmit the wisdom that had been gained while supporting the continued evolution of consciousness in directions that served the highest good of all. The peace that had been established was revealed to be not a static condition, but a dynamic process that required constant creativity and adaptation. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities for growth, while the Thu'um that connected all participants in the collective consciousness continued to evolve in ways that opened new possibilities for service and expression. As he stood once again in the valley where the great convergence had taken place, watching patterns of light dance overhead that seemed to celebrate the ongoing work of creation and healing, Miraak felt a profound sense of connection to purposes that extended far beyond his individual existence. The journey that had begun with whispers in temple halls had led to participation in cosmic processes that would continue long after his mortal form had returned to the elements from which it had emerged. The future stretched ahead, like an infinite tapestry, waiting for new patterns to be woven into its design, and he knew that the work of consciousness and creation would continue as long as existence itself endured, supported by the willing service of beings who chose to transcend their limitations in service of something greater than themselves. The third year following the Great Convergence marked the beginning of what would later be remembered as the Golden Age of Consciousness, a period when the synthesis of dragon wisdom and mortal innovation reached full maturity and began to express itself in ways that transformed not just Tamriel but the fundamental nature of existence itself. The changes that had begun as desperate attempts to end a destructive war had evolved into something far more profound, the emergence of new forms of life and consciousness that embodied possibilities previously confined to the realm of theoretical speculation. Miraak's role during this period was simultaneously central and nearly invisible, as his influence operated through channels so subtle and pervasive that many beings benefited from his presence without ever becoming consciously aware of it. The Thu'um that had awakened within him had become something like the underlying melody that gave coherence and beauty to the vast symphony of existence, supporting and harmonizing with countless other voices while remaining itself part of the greater whole. The communities that had emerged from the ashes of the old conflict began to display characteristics that defied all previous understanding of social organization and individual development. Children grew up learning to communicate with stones and streams as easily as with their own families, while adults discovered within themselves capabilities for creation and healing that seemed to flow from sources beyond their personal experience or training. In the great libraries that had been established to preserve and explore the new knowledge emerging from the collective consciousness, scholars worked alongside dragons to document revelations that arrived not through research, but through direct perception of truths that had always existed, but had never before been accessible to awareness operating within the constraints of separated consciousness. These libraries became centers of pilgrimage for beings from across the known world and beyond, as word of the transformation spread through networks of communication that operated according to principles that transcended the limitations of physical travel. Visitors would arrive carrying questions about their own spiritual development or the challenges facing their communities, only to discover that the answers they sought were already present within the collective awareness that permeated these sacred spaces. Miraak often served as a guide for such pilgrims, though his approach to teaching bore no resemblance to the formal instruction that had characterized the old dragon cult. Instead of presenting himself as an authority dispensing wisdom to students, he would engage in conversations that gradually revealed how the knowledge they sought was already present within their own consciousness, waiting only for the proper conditions to emerge into awareness. The Thu'um that flowed through these interactions carried harmonics that seemed to dissolve the barriers between questioner and answer, teacher and student, individual and universal. Pilgrims would leave these encounters feeling not that they had received information from an external source, but that they had been helped to remember truths that had always been part of their deepest nature. The influence of these interactions rippled outward through the networks of connection that linked the transformed communities, creating waves of understanding and capability that strengthened the entire collective consciousness. Each individual who achieved deeper integration with the greater awareness became a focal point for further expansion, drawing more beings into the network while simultaneously supporting the continued evolution of those already participating. The dragons who had become partners in this great work underwent their own remarkable transformations during this period. Their ancient wisdom, which had been preserved through millennia of isolated contemplation, began to evolve and expand through exposure to the innovative perspectives that emerged from their collaboration with mortal consciousness. The rigid categories and hierarchies that had once defined draconic society gave way to fluid forms of relationship that allowed for unprecedented levels of creativity and growth. Paarthurnax, whose mountain retreat had become a center of learning that attracted seekers from across the dimensional spectrum, began to develop new forms of Thu'um that combined the temporal depth of dragon knowledge with the adaptability and innovation that characterized mortal consciousness. These hybrid techniques created possibilities for healing and creation that neither species could have achieved in isolation. The effects of these developments were visible throughout the natural world, as the harmony between conscious beings began to influence the very foundations of physical reality. Regions that had been devastated by the war experienced regeneration that went beyond mere recovery to achieve new levels of beauty and abundance. Forests grew in patterns that seemed to embody musical harmonies, while rivers flowed in courses that created landscapes of almost supernatural perfection. Yet perhaps the most remarkable manifestations of the emerging consciousness appeared in the realm of artistic creation, as beings inspired by their participation in the collective awareness began to produce works that seemed to channel beauty and meaning from sources beyond individual imagination. Musicians composed symphonies that could heal listeners of ailments both physical and spiritual, while visual artists created images that served as gateways to expanded states of consciousness. These works of art became focal points for further expansion of the network, as exposure to them gradually awakened dormant capacities within observers and listeners. Galleries and concert halls emerged as centers of transformation, where the simple act of appreciation could trigger profound shifts in awareness that connected individuals to the greater consciousness that was evolving throughout the world. The architecture that emerged during this period reflected the same synthesis of wisdom and innovation that characterized all aspects of the transformed society. Buildings were designed not merely to serve practical functions, but to support the ongoing evolution of consciousness within their inhabitants. Structures incorporated geometric principles that created resonances with cosmic harmonies, while materials were chosen for their ability to amplify and focus the subtle energies that connected all participants in the collective awareness. Miraak's own dwelling during this period was a modest structure that seemed almost to disappear into the landscape around it. Yet visitors consistently reported that spending time within its walls left them feeling more connected to their deepest purposes and most authentic selves. The building itself seemed to embody the principle of humble service that had guided his entire journey, providing support for growth and understanding without drawing attention to itself. The children born during this golden age displayed capabilities that suggested the consciousness transformation was not merely a temporary phenomenon, but a permanent evolution in the nature of existence itself. these young beings could perceive and interact with dimensions of reality that remained largely invisible to their elders, while their natural facility with various forms of Thu'um suggested that the barriers between different levels of consciousness were continuing to dissolve. Through his interactions with these remarkable children, Miraak began to understand that his own role was gradually shifting from that of an active agent of change to something more like a guardian of the wisdom that had been achieved. The foundations had been laid for forms of consciousness that could continue to evolve and expand without requiring the kind of dramatic interventions that had been necessary during the crisis period. Yet even as he recognized this shift, Miraak remained deeply engaged with the ongoing work of integration and stabilization that was required to ensure the permanent establishment of the new reality. The forces that had once threatened to tear the cosmic order apart had been transformed rather than destroyed, and maintaining their constructive integration required constant attention and wisdom. The network of consciousness that connected all participants in the transformation began to develop what could only be described as its own form of intelligence, a collective awareness that could perceive and respond to challenges and opportunities with a speed and effectiveness that far exceeded the capabilities of any individual mind. This network consciousness seemed to operate according to principles that balanced the preservation of individual identity and autonomy with the benefits of collective wisdom and cooperation. As the Golden Age continued to unfold, reports began to arrive of similar transformations occurring in distant regions and even other dimensions, suggesting that the changes initiated by the convergence were spreading far beyond their original scope. Emissaries from other worlds began to appear, seeking to understand how the synthesis of wisdom and innovation had been achieved, and whether similar results could be replicated under different conditions. These contacts led to the establishment of what could only be called an interdimensional network of consciousness, connecting beings across vast reaches of space and time who shared the common goal of supporting the evolution of awareness and the maintenance of cosmic balance. Miraak found himself serving as one of the primary liaisons in this vast network, his Thu'um providing a bridge between different forms of consciousness that might otherwise have remained incompatible. The responsibility that came with these expanded connections was both humbling and inspiring, as he began to understand that the peaceful resolution of the Dragon War had been not an isolated achievement, but part of a vast cosmic pattern of healing and integration that was occurring across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The work they had done had contributed to a transformation that was literally reshaping the fundamental structure of existence itself. As he stood in the valley where the great convergence had taken place, now transformed into a garden of such beauty that visitors often wept simply from exposure to its perfection, Miraak reflected upon the journey that had brought them to this moment of fulfillment. The Thu'um that flowed through him carried harmonics that seemed to celebrate not just what had been achieved, but the infinite possibilities that stretched ahead, waiting to be explored by consciousness that had learned to transcend the limitations of separation and fear. The culmination of Miraak's journey came not with fanfare or dramatic revelation, but with the gentle recognition that the work he had been called to accomplish had reached a state of natural completion. The consciousness transformation that had begun with whispered conversations in temple halls had grown into a self-sustaining network of awareness that no longer required his active guidance to continue its evolution and expansion. The valley that had served as the focal point for the Great Convergence had become something resembling a living mandala, its every feature precisely arranged to support the ongoing cultivation of wisdom and compassion among all who entered its boundaries. The lake at its center reflected not only the sky above, but glimpses of the infinite dimensions of consciousness that had been opened through the collaborative work of countless beings over the years of transformation. Miraak spent his days in this sacred space engaged in what could only be called pure contemplation. His awareness expanded to encompass perspectives that spanned from the most intimate details of individual existence to cosmic patterns that operated across geological ages. The Thu'um, that had once required conscious effort and careful modulation, now flowed through him as naturally as breathing, its harmonics creating conditions that supported growth and understanding in all who came within its influence. Visitors to the valley during this period often reported experiences that defied ordinary description, as the simple act of being present in the space seemed to trigger profound shifts in their understanding of themselves and their place in the greater pattern of existence. Yet these transformations occurred without drama or disturbance, unfolding with the same gentle inevitability that characterized the changing of seasons or the growth of ancient trees. The dragons, who had become his closest collaborators in the work of consciousness integration, began to speak of preparing for their own transitions to levels of existence that transcended the need for physical manifestation. Their ancient forms were becoming increasingly translucent, as if the matter that composed them was gradually being replaced by pure consciousness that required no material substrate to maintain its coherence and purpose. Paarthurnax, whose wisdom had guided so many through the challenges of transformation, spent long hours in dialogue with Miraak about the nature of completion and the graceful acceptance of cycles that had fulfilled their intended purpose. These conversations took place in harmonics that went beyond ordinary language, their exchange of understanding creating resonances that seemed to strengthen the very fabric of reality around them. The collective consciousness that had emerged from their collaborative efforts had evolved to the point where it could maintain and expand itself without requiring the kind of focused intervention that had been necessary during its initial formation. New centers of transformation were emerging spontaneously throughout the world, each one serving as a node in the ever-expanding network of integrated awareness. The children who had been born during the Golden Age were now coming of age with capabilities that made them natural guardians and guides for the continuing evolution of consciousness. Their intuitive understanding of the principles that governed cosmic balance allowed them to address challenges and opportunities with a wisdom that often surprised their elders, while their natural facility with various forms of Thu'um suggested unlimited possibilities for future development. Through his interactions with these remarkable young beings, Miraak began to understand that the consciousness transformation had achieved a kind of critical mass that made its continued evolution inevitable. The seeds that had been planted through years of patient cultivation had grown into a forest of awareness that could continue to expand and diversify according to its own inner wisdom. The peace that had been established throughout the former war zones had evolved far beyond the mere absence of conflict to become something that could only be described as active harmony. Communities operated according to principles that balanced individual creativity with collective well-being, while conflicts that arose were resolved through dialogue and understanding that drew upon the deep wisdom available through connection to the network of consciousness. The Thu'um itself had become so integrated into daily life that many beings used its various forms as naturally as they employed spoken language, creating a constant background of harmonious vibration that supported health and happiness in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Children learned to communicate with plants and animals using gentle forms of the Thu'um that promoted growth and healing, while adults employed more complex applications to coordinate community projects and resolve disputes. The natural world had responded to this pervasive harmony by achieving new levels of beauty and abundance that seemed to embody the very essence of paradise described in the most ancient myths. Seasons flowed into one another with perfect timing, while weather patterns created conditions that supported both wild ecosystems and cultivated landscapes in optimal balance. Miraak's own physical form began to show signs of the same translucent quality that characterized the ancient dragons, as if his consciousness was gradually transcending the need for material manifestation while remaining fully present and engaged with the world around him. Yet this transformation brought with it no sense of loss or separation, but rather a deepening connection to all forms of existence that felt like the most natural fulfillment of his journey. The meditation sessions that had once required formal structure and careful preparation now occurred as spontaneous expressions of his essential nature, with awareness expanding and contracting like the breathing of some cosmic entity of which he had become an integral part. During these periods of expanded consciousness, he could perceive the vast network of beings across multiple dimensions who were engaged in similar work, all contributing to the ongoing evolution of existence itself. The legacy that had emerged from their collective efforts was visible not only in the transformed communities and landscapes of the immediate region, but in subtle shifts that were occurring throughout the fabric of reality itself. The fundamental tone of existence had shifted toward greater harmony and integration, creating conditions that supported the emergence of ever more sophisticated forms of consciousness and creative expression. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, Miraak found himself spending increasing amounts of time in states of consciousness that transcended ordinary temporal awareness, his perception encompassing past, present, and future as aspects of a single eternal moment. From this expanded perspective, the journey that had begun with his humble service in the temple halls of Solstheim revealed itself as part of a pattern so vast and beautiful that he could only respond with profound gratitude for having been allowed to play his part in its unfolding. The Thu'um that flowed through him during these transcendent moments carried harmonics that seemed to celebrate not just the completion of his individual mission, but the endless continuation of consciousness evolution that would persist long after his own participation had transitioned to other forms and dimensions. The work would continue, carried forward by countless beings who had been touched by the transformation and who would in their turn serve as catalysts for further expansion and integration. As the evening mist began to gather around the valley, carrying with it the gentle songs of creatures whose existence had been made possible by the harmony that now permeated the landscape, Miraak felt a profound sense of peaceful completion settle into his awareness. The mission that had called him from his quiet devotion so many years before had been accomplished not through conquest or domination, but through the patient cultivation of understanding and compassion that had ultimately transformed the very nature of existence itself. The stars emerged overhead in patterns that seemed to reflect the cosmic harmonies that had been achieved through their collaborative efforts, while the aurora borealis danced in celebration of consciousness that had learned to transcend the limitations of separation and fear. In the gentle rhythm of his breathing, Miraak could hear echoes of the great convergence that had changed everything, its effects continuing to ripple outward through dimensions of reality that stretched beyond the reach of mortal imagination. The peace that surrounded him was not the peace of endings but of eternal continuation, the quiet joy of consciousness that had discovered its infinite capacity for growth and service in the endless dance of existence. In the timeless space that exists beyond the measurement of mortal years, Miraak's consciousness settled into a state of being that transcended all distinctions between individual existence and universal awareness. The valley that had served as the focal point for so much transformation became a place where time itself seemed to pause in recognition of the profound completion that had been achieved, its every stone and stream singing with harmonies that celebrated the eternal nature of the work that had been accomplished. The Thu'um that had awakened within him during those early days of discovery had evolved far beyond any technique or power that could be learned or mastered through conventional means. It had become the very voice of creation itself, expressing through his consciousness the fundamental frequencies that maintained the structure of existence across all dimensions and timelines. Yet this cosmic responsibility rested upon him with no weight of burden, but rather with the lightness that comes from perfect alignment with one's deepest purpose in nature. Visitors to the valley during this final phase of his embodied existence would often find him sitting beside the lake in meditation, so profound that his physical form seemed to flicker between states of matter and pure consciousness. Yet despite this apparent detachment from ordinary reality, his presence radiated a warmth and accessibility that drew beings from across the dimensional spectrum to seek his guidance and blessing. The conversations that took place during these encounters operated according to principles that transcended ordinary language, as understanding passed directly from consciousness to consciousness without the intermediary of words or concepts. Pilgrims would arrive carrying questions about the deepest mysteries of existence, only to discover that in Miraak's presence, their confusion naturally resolved into clarity that felt like the remembrance of truths they had always known, but temporarily forgotten. The dragons who had shared his journey toward cosmic integration began to speak of him in terms usually reserved for the most ancient and revered aspects of creation itself. They recognized in his transformed consciousness a perfect embodiment of the synthesis between wisdom and innovation that had been their shared goal from the beginning of their collaboration. His presence among them served as a constant reminder of what could be achieved when individual will aligned completely with universal purpose. Parthenax, whose own journey toward transcendence was following a parallel path, spent countless hours in communion with Miraak that required no physical proximity or verbal exchange. Their consciousness had become so intimately connected through years of shared work that they could communicate across vast distances through resonances that operated at the level of pure intention and understanding. During these exchanges, they explored together the implications of what their collaborative efforts had achieved, recognizing that the transformation of consciousness that had begun as a response to local crisis had evolved into something that was literally reshaping the fundamental structure of reality across multiple levels of existence. The peace they had helped to establish was not merely an absence of conflict, but an active principle of harmony that was spreading throughout the cosmic order, like ripples from a stone dropped into an infinite pond. The collective consciousness that had emerged from their work had achieved a level of stability and self-sustaining growth that made it clear the transformation would continue long after the individual beings who had initiated it had moved beyond the need for physical manifestation. The network of awareness that connected countless beings across vast reaches of space and time had become a permanent feature of existence itself, a living testament to the power of cooperation and understanding to overcome even the most fundamental forms of separation and discord. The children who had grown to maturity within this transformed reality began to display capabilities that suggested consciousness evolution was accelerating rather than reaching some final state of completion. Their natural facility with forms of awareness that integrated multiple dimensions simultaneously indicated that the synthesis achieved by their elders was not an endpoint, but rather a foundation for developments that would continue to unfold throughout future ages. Through his interactions with these remarkable young beings, Miraak came to understand that his own role was transitioning from active participation to something more like a living memory of the transformation process itself. His consciousness was becoming a repository of the wisdom and understanding that had been gained through the long journey from conflict to harmony, available to guide and inspire future generations who would face their own challenges and opportunities for growth. The Thu'um that flowed through him during this period carried frequencies that seemed to encode the entire history of their collaborative work, from the first tentative steps toward cooperation to the magnificent synthesis that had been achieved through patient dedication to principles of understanding and compassion. These harmonics created a kind of temporal bridge that allowed beings in the present to access the accumulated wisdom of all who had contributed to the transformation, while simultaneously planting seeds for developments that would manifest in ages yet to come. The natural world around the valley had achieved a state of perfection that seemed to embody the very essence of the paradise described in the most ancient creation myths. Yet this was not a static perfection, but rather a dynamic harmony that continued to evolve and express new forms of beauty with each passing season. The aurora borealis appeared almost constantly overhead, its dancing lights creating patterns that seemed to celebrate the ongoing work of consciousness evolution that was occurring at every level of existence. As Miraak's awareness expanded to encompass ever broader perspectives on the cosmic patterns of which their work had been a part, he began to perceive other beings across the vast reaches of space and time who were engaged in similar missions of healing and integration. The consciousness transformation that had begun in the war-torn regions of Tamriel was revealed to be part of a universal pattern of evolution that was occurring simultaneously throughout countless worlds and dimensions. The recognition of this vast network of consciousness workers brought with it a profound sense of connection and shared purpose that transcended all boundaries of species, location, or temporal sequence. Miraak understood that his individual journey had been one note in a cosmic symphony of such scope and beauty that mortal minds could barely grasp its periphery, yet every note was essential to the harmony of the whole. The peace that settled over his consciousness during this recognition was not the peace of completion, but rather the peace of perfect participation in something infinitely greater than individual existence. The Thu'um that had awakened within him was revealed to be part of a universal language of creation that connected all conscious beings across every dimension of reality, allowing for communication and cooperation that operated according to principles of love and understanding, rather than dominance or control. As the seasons flowed around him with the rhythm of eternal return, Miraak's physical form gradually became more translucent, as if the matter that composed it was slowly being transformed into the pure consciousness that had always been his essential nature. Yet this transition brought with it no sense of loss or separation, but rather a deepening integration with all forms of existence that felt like the most natural fulfillment of his journey. The meditation that had once required formal practice and careful attention now occurred as the spontaneous expression of his being, with awareness expanding and contracting in harmony with cosmic rhythms that operated at scales ranging from the quantum to the galactic. During these periods of expanded consciousness, he could perceive the vast web of connections that linked every aspect of existence in patterns of such intricate beauty that observation alone was a form of worship. The valley itself began to take on qualities that suggested it was becoming a permanent gateway between dimensions, a place where beings from across the spectrum of existence could gather to share wisdom and coordinate their efforts toward the ongoing evolution of consciousness. The lake at its center reflected not just the sky above, but glimpses of the infinite realms of possibility that had been opened through the collective work of countless beings over eons of patient dedication. As the final phase of his embodied existence drew toward its natural conclusion, Miraak found himself surrounded by the presence of all who had shared his journey toward transcendence. Dragons and mortals, cosmic entities and newborn children, all gathered in celebration of what had been achieved and in preparation for the continuations that would unfold in ages yet to come. The Thu'um that rose from this gathering carried harmonics that seemed to encompass every voice that had ever contributed to the great work of consciousness transformation, creating a symphony of such profound beauty that it seemed to strengthen the very foundations of reality itself. In this music, Miraak heard echoes of his first tentative words in the temple halls of Solstheim, now transformed into melodies that would continue to inspire and guide beings throughout all future ages. As the last light of embodied existence faded from his physical form, Miraak's consciousness expanded to encompass the totality of what had been achieved through their collaborative efforts. The peace that had been established was not confined to any single location or time period, but had become a permanent feature of the cosmic order itself, an eternal reminder that consciousness, when guided by wisdom and compassion, possessed unlimited capacity for healing and transformation. In the gentle silence that followed, The valley continued to sing with voices both ancient and newly born, their harmonies carrying forward the work of creation and integration that would continue for as long as existence itself endured. The Thu'um that had been Miraak's gift to the world lived on in every being who chose understanding over hatred, cooperation over domination, and service over self-interest. And in the quiet places of memory, where the most profound truths rest in eternal stillness, this tale continues to unfold. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest times, consciousness guided by love possesses the power to transform any conflict into an opportunity for growth, any separation into a chance for deeper connection, and any ending into a new beginning filled with infinite possibility for beauty and peace. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, while the aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that celebrated the endless creativity of consciousness, learning to know itself through countless forms and expressions, each one precious, each one contributing to the vast symphony of existence that plays on without beginning or end in the timeless space, where all beings ultimately discover their unity in the heart of creation itself.